Welcome to the Sales Influence Podcast, where we talk about finding the why in how people buy. I'm your host, Victor Antonio. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for always lending me your ears. Today, I want to talk about first impressions, more specifically, final first impressions. Yes, I came up with that phrase because I think first impressions are a falsehood. Let me break it down. First, Inc. magazine released a recent article. The article was done by a gentleman by the name of Peter Economy. Yes, I don't make that name up. It said, according to this truly surprising new study, you have just 27 seconds to make a first impression. And surprisingly, 69% of the people reported that they form a first impression of someone before they even had a chance to speak. Let me say that again because I want you to register this. According to this study, you have just 27 seconds to make a first impression. And 69% of people reported that they form a first impression of someone before they've even had a chance to speak. Now, that might be true. I mean, come on. We always argue about or talk about, never judge a book by its cover. But the reality is we're programmed for judgment. We're programmed to make distinction. We're programmed to see the differences in something. So, for example, if you're walking down a road, right, back in the day, we're talking primitive days, and down this left road, you see a lion, and down the right road, you see a kitty cat, you're going to make a judgment call on which trail is safer. Now, they both belong to the feline, group, but one is more violent than the other, right? You got the lion's a little tougher than the kitty. I'm going down the kitty road. That's how our brain works. It assesses, it judges, and then it makes a decision. We are programmed to make decisions. We are programmed to draw conclusions very quickly. When we see something, we assess and we decide. That's how we operate. That's part of our, natural being. And according to a new study, and this is based on this new study by 2,000 Americans commissioned by the Dollar Shave Club, that's the amount of time, 27 seconds, it takes to make a first impression, in case you're wondering where that data came from. Now, what's interesting is that they then list what the study suggests are reasons why or how we judge somebody. The first one, whether they smile or not. So smiling is important to improve or get a better first impression, good first impression. You got to be polite, maybe well-spoken. I think that's a big one right there, well-spoken. You got to make eye contact. You got to be a good listener. They even had, you got to smell nice. That always helps. And you got to hold a conversation well. Now, I would add to that list that you also have to be a person that is empathetic. In other words, you really try to understand the other person's point of view, and maybe, may I add, dare I say, you ask great questions. This will create a great first impression. But notice that in order for us to talk about first impression, I want to introduce a new phrase called the final first impression. And the final first impression means this. Let's say you meet somebody for the first time. You're going to make an initial judgment. Your first impression. But maybe, just maybe, after 30 minutes of conversation, you walk away thinking, I had that person sized up incorrectly. I was wrong. Have you ever had that happen to you? You look at somebody for the first time and you go, I don't know. And then you start talking to the person. They start conversating with you. You're having a great back and forth conversation. And at the end of 30 minutes, you walk away with a different impression than the first impression, which I call the final first impression. And I think it's the same thing in selling. A lot of people have initial first impressions. But in order to really drive up your final first impression, in order to make an impact, I truly believe that the two components that you have to really drive a good final first impression is that you have to be empathetic, willing to listen to the other person, but more importantly, this is the big one. You got to be able to ask great questions, great quality questions. It is the quality of your questions that will determine how people perceive you. If you ask simple questions, you will be perceived as simple. If you ask deep, insightful questions, you will be perceived as deep and insightful. I've said this in the past, and I'll say it again. The average salesperson practices what to say. The superior salesperson practices what to ask. It is in asking questions that you leave a great impression. But also, in asking these great questions, you could also extract information and guide the conversation to whatever endpoint you want to drive it towards. So again, I want to drive home the point that if you have great conversation, if you're empathetic, you can always shift somebody's perception of you. So even if you screwed up the first time, because we've sometimes have made a bad first impression, right? You can change that impression by simply showing empathy, asking great questions, being insightful, going deep. You can change somebody's first impression of you. Too often I see these studies that talk about, well, once you make a first impression, it takes you about 15 more points of contact before you can change somebody's mind. But what they fail to leave out is that first impression may be bad, but I'm telling you, you can rescue any bad first impression by simply being deep, asking great questions, demonstrating knowledge, having great conversation. There's always a comeback to make a great final first impression. And that is it for this Sales Influence podcast. Remember, leaving a first impression is part of influence and persuasion. Being able to convince people that you are a person to be trusted and they should buy from you. Anyway, that's it for the Sales Influence podcast. Don't forget to leave me some feedback on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. Let me know what you think. I'd greatly appreciate it. Also, check out my online sales training platform, the Sales Velocity Academy. Over 50 courses, 500 videos, my 14 books. If you're serious about increasing your sales velocity, go to salesvelocityacademy.com. Lastly, I want to thank you for listening. This is Victor Antonio, always reminding you, selling ain't hard when you know how. Take care. Hi, I'm Victor Antonio. I'm an author, sales trainer, and keynote speaker. I'm often asked, what makes a great speaker? Is it someone who delivers real content that the audience can use? Is it someone who engages the audience so they're part of the learning experience? Or is it someone who can motivate an audience to push them beyond their comfort zone and discover new abilities? The answer is yes. But the most important thing to remember is that I'm not there to look good. I'm there to make my client look good. Simply put, it's never about me, and it's always about them.